Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Creating an Inclusive Collection, Selecting and Evaluating Diverse Resources, which is sponsored by ProQuest and Choice. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and perhaps a chat panel. If you don't see the chat panel, you can click the button sort of on the bottom middle part of your screen that's trying real hard to look like a dialog cloud, and that should open up the chat panel for you. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. At the end of the presentation, they'll take a few minutes to respond to your questions, so please do send them in throughout. If you experience any technical issues, that's what the chat panel is for. Please use that to message me directly, and I will troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRLChoiceWebinars during the program, so if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right, and I believe here to set the stage for us is Ann Doherty, the Resources for College Libraries Project Editor at ACRL and Choice. So I will turn the floor over to you, Ann.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Ann Doherty, and I'm the RCL Project Editor. I'm going to start today by spending just a few minutes to introduce you to Resources for College Libraries database. We'll talk about the overarching themes and challenges in creating an inclusive collection. And then I'm going to pass things over to two RCL subject editors to speak more about this topic from a disciplinary standpoint. The Resources for College Libraries database is a subscription database that is co-published by Choice ACRL together with ProQuest. It's a core collection for undergraduate libraries that offers over 90,000 titles across 125 subject disciplines, both covering the liberal arts college curriculum as well as the community or two-year college curriculum. RCL is core and comprehensive, so we're adding titles on an ongoing basis and updating the database. We add over 3,000 new titles a year on average, but we also maintain and review those canonical and core titles that may have been historically published but retain value for the current undergraduate library curriculum. RCL is maintained and overseen by a group of over 70 subject editors, and these are practicing academic librarians doing the work of bibliographic selection, instruction in academic libraries. RCL is also peer-reviewed by academic librarians and faculty. To date, over 500 referees have participated across over 400 contributing institutions. Because RCL is a sister product to Choice, the RCL database has select Choice reviews in it, as well as Choice outstanding academic title identifiers. So this is a really easy way for database users to find those titles and those contents that are relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion that have also been noted by Choice as outstanding content. Just going to briefly look at a few use cases. So for our purposes today, where we're talking about ways that libraries can be building a more inclusive collection with attention to diverse and equitable resources, we think of RCL as a benchmarking tool and as a way that to identify titles to add to collections and possibly titles which should be not weeded from academic library collections. It can also be useful if you're at an institution where you rely on patron-driven acquisitions or faculty input for making title selections to make sure that you're providing a real balanced core collection for your users. What's new in the RCL database? We've added over 1,300 titles since January, and we now have synthetics unbound discovery elements in RCL. So these are interactive visual enrichments that make it easier for subscribing institutions and users to find the content that's interesting and valuable to their library research and collections work. Because we partner with ProQuest, there are also RCL identifiers in the eBook Central Academic Complete collection, as well as the Synthetics Unbound catalog enrichment. So let's take a look at jump off here in our conversation about inclusive collections. And I find a definition can sometimes be a useful thing to start with. This definition of inclusive collections is based on the interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. And I'm just going to read it out loud because I realize that some of you may be multitasking and listening to this while you're eating your lunch or doing some other work on campus. So librarians have a professional responsibility to be inclusive in collection development and in the provision of interlibrary loan. This includes content that reflect a diversity of issues, whether they be, for example, political, economic, religious, social, ethnic, or sexual. A balanced collection reflects a diversity of content, not an equality of numbers. So I think this is a really good definition to help start off the conversation. Obviously, individual institutions are going to need to have conversations and updating collection policies about what an inclusive collection might look like for your institution and your library materials. So what are some of the challenges that libraries and librarians are facing when you're starting to, try to be present and do the work of creating inclusive collections to offer your users? Well, one challenge, obviously, is that the collection that you oversee is not isolated. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a local solution to what are larger global, institutionalized, often structural issues. So within the higher education ecosystem and within the publishing industry, we know, or most of us know, that there are some imbalances in the types of materials that are published and the types of people that are publishing these materials. So we can only buy the books, we can only make available the materials that are available to us. So I think understanding that challenge and recognizing it is an important first step in this process. The other thing is that collection management is non-neutral. So checking our individual selector biases, and if you are at an institution that relies on patron-driven acquisition or relies on faculty input when making selections, recognizing that there are going to be some biases there in the types of materials that are recommended for purchase, as well as relying on vendor resources and kind of questioning and just doing a check about how well those vendor resources are helping you to provide a really inclusive collection to your users. And then finally, this challenge, which I think could be a bullet point on any library presentation about library workflows and challenges, is a scarcity of time and resources. And I think kind of recognizing that at the start can help you as you define how you want to move forward. So big overarching challenges. What are some considerations in trying to face those challenges? The first one that I want to recommend is turning outward to expand inclusivity. And I'm borrowing this phrase specifically from the Libraries Transforming Communities campaign from ALA that's done in partnership with the Harvard Institute for Public Innovation. And this is a phrase and terminology that we're predominantly seeing in public libraries. And so I think kind of that's a good inspiration point to turn outward and see how we in academic library communities can take learning and best practices maybe from the public library sphere, maybe from what's going on in children and young adult library publications in the We Need Diverse Books movement, kind of turn outward outside of our academic library comfort zone, but also, of course, turning outward into the community that we're trying to serve to get feedback and input as we look to build inclusive collections. Create infrastructure and workflows that allow for collaboration and intersectionality. So here, look for ways that if you're in a library that has a dedicated collection development team, how that team can maybe work with other departments within the library and other library projects on collaboration towards a more inclusive collection, as well as in conversation with other campus units and stakeholders. So, don't try to reinvent the wheel if there's some natural collaboration and intersection with other units and departments on campus that are interested and invested in doing similar work on improving diversity and equitable collections. And then finally, allocating the time and the resources to marginalized perspectives. So obviously, funds is a big challenge, and the scarcity of funds is a big challenge facing many academic libraries. Making an argument to library administrators or to campus administrators that funds should be dedicated to building diverse collections, I think, is something that's very worthwhile to do, especially at this moment in time. One of my subject editors, Angela Weaver, who's at the University of Washington, calls it aspirational selection, and I think that's a really great phrase to use for how you might want to try to leave room to build your collections beyond what might speak to your immediate curricular needs. Advocate for time to evaluate and assess your collections to find gaps that you might need to fill or strengthen areas of weakness. And then also, this might be a good time to consider whether something like a task force or a pilot project can be initiated to dedicate more human resources and financial resources to something like building up a collection that has attention to more historically marginalized perspectives or groups. I want to speak just a little bit about some of the RCL approaches to creating a more inclusive core collection. One thing that we did is we developed specific alternate subject language and classification schemas. So we departed from an LC classification scheme for resources for college libraries and built a curriculum-based subject classification. And what this has allowed us to do is to focus more attention and have the flexibility and adaptability to create specific Latino studies or Asian American studies categories and use language and terminology that is current and flexible to emerging publication trends and the scholarly community. Diversify the creator pool. So for us, the role of peer review is really critical in helping us to improve and change the editorial direction of our subject bibliographies and actively seeking out a diverse peer review pool, a diverse subject editor pool, and to the extent to which you can do that in your institutions and kind of diversify and broaden the voices that are allowed to have input into your collection building process, I think will help strengthen the ultimate collection. And then lastly, balancing quantitative data with qualitative informed decisions. So I know that there's been a huge increase in the amount of data that is available and data-driven collection development decisions. And I think that those data points are often really important. And I think, though, that we should also be mindful when we're talking about a diverse and balanced collection that making decisions by circulation stats and cost per use doesn't always give us a full picture of the kind of content we want to make available to our users from a diversity and an inclusive standpoint. So allow yourself some room to apply a quality measure and a quality perspective like we bring from RCL to your collection building practices. I'm going to go ahead and now that I've kind of given you a little snapshot of RCL and the overarching challenges and considerations about building inclusive collections, I'm going to hand it over to the RCL subject editors.
Thanks, Anne. As Anne mentioned, I'm the RCL editor for African American Studies. African American Studies, by definition, is a multidisciplinary field and is also relatively new as an academic discipline, which brings some unique challenges. Most librarians who select in this field have a background in a traditional discipline and often lack in-depth knowledge of other fields. In addition, most scholars in the field have a PhD in a traditional discipline, as there are few PhD granting African American Studies departments. In compiling the RCL collection, the broad areas include works that comprise the canon of the field, and then works that are reflective of developing areas of inquiry. Of course, the canon of the field is not static and grows as new studies become foundational parts of the literature. The peer review process utilized by RCL is helpful in determining which studies enter the canon. In that process, experts within the field examine the RCL listings and suggest additions and deletions. Since the experts often have a differing background from the editor, their comments are especially useful. Grasping new areas of inquiry and trying to examine how the literature is developing in this area is a little more complicated, and I'd like to focus on that. Various types of literature reviews are helpful in analyzing the development of the field and which topics are coming to the fore. Conference presentations are useful as they are a reflection of areas that scholars are working on and often later become essential elements of monographs. Dissertations are also helpful as they often become the basis of monographs. Monitoring vendor lists, such as books in print, vendor lists and books in print which often include forthcoming titles, can also be useful. Some of the major conferences that I monitor include the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, the Modern Language Association, the National Council for Black Studies, and the American Sociological Association. The OAH has begun creating a sound word cloud, which they call a theme visualizer for their conference presentations. You can click on a word, for example, slavery, bottom second to the left, and you'll retrieve a listing of various words that intersect with slavery and titles of various presentations. And then you can click on them and you'll see an example of a conference presentation which gives you the presenter and the entire title. Dissertations can also be searched through ProQuest Dissertations International. You can limit the searches by granting department, but again, because most of the dissertations in this field are not from departments of African American Studies, you have to supplement that by doing a keyword search for relevant dissertations. You can use vendor lists. For instance, this is Gobi. That's not an advertisement. It just happens to be one that I use, the institution I was at. And they often include, or do include, forthcoming titles as well as titles that are in print currently. And then there's also books in print, which you can search by year of publication and do keyword searches. When you examine the field and the work that's being done, there are three of the most important areas where current work is taking place is in intersectionality, diasporic studies, and a field I'm just calling historical revisionism. Intersectionality examines power relations through the prism of class, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity. Some of the recent works that have come in this field are a biography of Louise Patterson. Patterson was previously most known for her friendship with Langston Hughes and other artists in the Harlem Renaissance. This biography examines Patterson's politics, including her leadership in the International Workers' Order, an ethnic-based insurance and benefit society that existed in the 30s through the 50s. And it interweaves her personal story with her cultural and political activities on the left. Imani Perry's biography of Lorraine Hansberry mostly being known for her play A Raisin in the Sun, examines how Hansberry's sexuality and left-wing politics shaped her life and writing. Tara Hunter's, To Joy My Freedom is a study of African-American women workers in the post-Civil War era South. And all of these studies attempt to interweave these issues of class, race, and gender as they tell their story. Recent diasporic studies include Herman Bennett's work on colonial blackness, a history of African descended people in Mexico, a book edited by Landers and Robinson that covers Blacks in colonial Latin America, and you'll also see example of books, Black Africans in Renaissance Europe, and Winning Our Freedoms Together, which is a study of the African Americans in relation with the struggle against apartheid. Some other works that are in this area, one is called Ren International in Black Caribbean, which is an examination of Black communists and their interrelationships in New York City, Mexico, and throughout the Caribbean. A second by John Monroe is The Anti-Colonial Front, which examines African American participation in the anti-colonial movement of the 40s through the 60s. And then also Julia Scott's book Common Wind, which is an examination of communications between African descended communities throughout the United States and the Caribbean during the era of the Haitian Revolution. Finally, there's this area I'm calling historical revisionism. Since African American studies developed out of some of the political and social struggles in the 1960s, that a key part of its reason for existing has always been to counter the erasure and the falsification of the experience of African Americans as it's been portrayed in traditional historiography. And one of the fields that is coming to the front is an examination of the role that slavery played in the development of capitalism. So books like Sven Becker's Empire of Cotton, A Global History, and Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, and Walter Johnson's River of Dark Dreams all try to explain how the institution of slavery shaped the economics, the structure, and the history of capitalism in the United States. And interestingly, the foundational work for all of this was done by historian Eric Williams in a book called Capitalism and Slavery, which was published in 1944, and then was largely kind of ignored for years. But just recently, people have re-examined his theories and then began to develop them even more. In addition to these areas of studies, there are also increasing examinations of the African American experience in the areas of food studies, medicine and health, and criminology. And again, if you go through looking at conference proceedings and looking at dissertations that are done recently, you'll see all of these areas come more and more to the fore. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Ellen Bosman, who's the RCL editor for GLBT Studies.
Thank you, Tim and Ann. As Tim mentioned, my name is Ellen Bosman. I'm head of tech services at New Mexico State University. I've been involved with the American Library Association Gay and Lesbian Roundtable for approximately 20 years, serving as the Stonewall Book Award Chair during part of that time. And in relationship to RCL, I am the original GLBTQ editor. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of the elements that are important and some of the challenges that you would encounter in developing a GLBTQ collection, and show you a few of the resources you might use that I also use to try to enhance the collection. So as librarians, we're all familiar with many of the best practices in creating collection development policies. Thus, I'm only going to focus on a few elements which I think might be especially useful in creating a GLBT collection development policy. And I think they're mostly important because we have a history, of course, of challenges for GLBT materials. And although those typically recur in a public library, it's worth keeping in mind and reinforcing the concepts of diversity and inclusion in our collections. And of course, the purpose of including such statements is to demonstrate our deliberate efforts to recognize the diverse populations that we serve and the intent to create collections which reflect those diverse populations. And I just put a link here to some of the ALA policies, and Anne's already touched on them. There is more than one, so it might be worth looking at a few of them. Another thing that you might keep in mind if you're developing a specific collection development policy for GLBTQ is to maybe note the programs on your campus that offer GLBT subject matter, and doing so would support and demonstrate the interdisciplinary nature of the subject area. It might also be worth noting in a collection development policy the levels of collecting intensity that you might want to put. The Library of Congress has adopted the recommendations from the Research Library Group, and that identifies 6 collection levels. And so maybe in your collection development policy, you might be interested in saying, in the area of graphic novels, we collect at this level, or in the area of serials, we collect at this level. And those could be really helpful both to future selectors to help you decide where to concentrate your efforts, and perhaps informative also to your users. I put a few sample policies here, Michigan State and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. These 2 policies are really nicely laid out, and they cover out many essential areas to collection development. One thing they both have in common, it's a very simple thing, is put a date on your collection development policy. However, interestingly, on both of these policies, they have been not updated for very many years. So perhaps their policies haven't changed, but it's always a good idea to review your policies and to date them periodically. So now we'll turn to how the RCL GLBTQ subject scheme was developed. This was probably the most challenging part, was developing the initial taxonomy. As Anne said, we didn't stick to things like the Library of Congress. So I took a very broad subject approach, and I hoped that it would make sense to the user, and while still grouping together similar things like the arts. I added new categories as they were needed. Especially helpful were the suggestions from the peer reviewers on categories. For example, one such category that was added a few years ago on a recommendation for a peer reviewer was a section on queer theory. And then I also added categories as maybe new research or subject areas appeared. One of the major questions I encountered in doing this was, should I include fiction or not? If I did, should I include children's and YA? And what should I do about individual video titles? And so right now, all of those are in the collection, but I'd be really interested in hearing later from some of you if you think that those things might be very useful to you if you had access to these tools. Because it's one of the areas that's, of course, very difficult to develop because it's just so constantly evolving. Here's what the GLBT subject scheme looks like. Just a little screenshot for you. You can see that there are many different subjects. Within each subject, there are also sub-subjects or subcategories. For example, if you were to click on the arts category, you would see dance and drama, comedy, film, literature, television, visual arts. There's a lot of subcategories, and even some of these are so large that they had to be divided further. So, for example, under literature are divisions for things like biography, literature criticism and review, poetry, popular fiction, etc. So there's really a lot here. Hopefully it's organized in a way that people find helpful. The peer reviewers, as I said, have made some suggestions and some modifications have been made over the years. Here are some things that I consulted that you could also consult in terms of developing the collection. I consulted Book Awards List, Choice magazine. I searched other collections in RCL, particularly collections that deal with sexuality, race, other issues related to gender. So I kind of checked what the other RCL editors have done to see if there's some overlap there. I consulted the journal Gay and Lesbian Review, and of course, as I mentioned, we've adopted suggestions from peer reviewers. If you're going to develop a GLBTQ collection, there are a couple of specific challenges. Because the body of literature is associated with a community that has developed at different rates over time and has primarily been influenced by the increasing visibility of a group. So one of the challenges is balancing or trying to balance the lesbian content versus the gay content versus the bisexual, transgendered, queer content. That can be particularly difficult. If we look, for example, at the LC subject headings, we could use that as one unscientific measure of the growing body of literature within each group. And simply put, as more literature becomes available, more subject headings are necessary. So, for example, the term lesbian has 186 authorized subject headings, but the term bisexuality has far fewer. So from this, one can guess that the body of literature on lesbians is greater than that related to bisexuality. So what this means in terms of collection development is that it's going to be very difficult to try to balance the literature between the LGBT community simply because one area consists of more publications than another. Another area for consideration is attempting to provide balance based on race or age diversity. This is particularly true in the categories of fiction and personal identity. Balancing the race and age can be complicated simply because the literature is harder to find to begin with. It may be because the literature is not as widely available. This could be for several reasons. LGBT stigmatization within communities that maybe prevent people from telling their own stories. Also bias in the publishing industry, which has long been dominated by Caucasians, so it might be harder to find different materials on other races and different people of different ages. Let's see, where the literature is available, it can also be complicated by our cataloging practices, as we do not always try to note racial or age representation in our cataloging. While there are specific subject headings that you can use in order to develop the collection, sometimes those are not always applied evenly, especially in the area of fiction. The interdisciplinary nature of the topic can also be a difficult element to keep in mind. You could use, again, the LC subject headings for developing or measuring the interdisciplinary nature of the collection. However, there are over 400 subject headings. And interestingly, a Canadian university did a study, a citation analysis of some of their dissertations, and they found that there was at least 40 other disciplines which overlapped the area of GLBT subject matter. And so the challenge of creating balance within this vast diversity is a very real challenge. However, if we can meet this challenge, it has some really great benefits. First of all, it gives us a fuller picture of history when we include other populations in our collection development. It also means that scholars don't have to draw on one distinctive method of particular disciplines, but they can also are well placed to create new approaches to their disciplines. And finally, if we can tackle this subject, it helps individuals and communities develop and grow because visibility and research, support, and resources are important considerations to making libraries a welcoming place for GLBTQ people. One of the ways it's been harder to identify GLBTQ materials is because there has been a decline in GLBT publishers. For example, St. Martin's Press used to publish a series entitled The Stonewall Inn Editions. However, they no longer publish that. So it is becoming more challenging to find material. Finally, we have differing research needs of different research populations. This could be tied back to the aforementioned collection levels that the Library of Congress uses. Obviously, undergraduates, graduate students, distance ed students, and faculty all have different needs. It's generally kind of thought of that undergraduates and the public should be able to get by with a more generalized collection, a less intensive collection. Whereas graduate students and faculty need more specialized resources as well as distance ed students. There was an interesting study regarding the differences, for example, in the need for ebooks. A 9-year study found that the doctoral students exhibited the strongest relationship with ebooks, but the undergraduate students and the faculty showed the weakest association with ebooks. So that's one example of different needs of researchers in relationship to at least one type of material. What can you do to analyze your collection to see how strong it is in the GLBT subject matter? Well, one way would be to look at quantitative and qualitative methods. They could be user-focused or collection-focused. Choosing a research method or a measurement method for an interdisciplinary subject is pretty challenging, so you might want to consider choosing a mixture of methods. You could, of course, look at the RCL. The advantage to this is that it is a subject-targeted and curated collection. It's updated frequently, and it also is peer-reviewed every 3 years. You can conduct a citation analysis, perhaps of local dissertations or theses, or maybe faculty publications. This could be a much more time-consuming way, but it could show a variety of patterns, such as the top journals, the ratio of books to journals, the most cited books, etc. White developed a brief test of collection strength. I'll go over this very quickly. You grab 40 titles in a particular subject area, and you look them up in WorldCat, and you assign them a number based on how many institutions hold the materials. When White did this, there were 4 collection levels. There's currently 5. And so it doesn't quite fit. You'd have to adjust it slightly. But the idea is that the more libraries that hold a title, the more likely the title is to be generalized in nature, whereas the fewer libraries that own the title, the more likely it is to be research in nature. So therefore, libraries with many titles assigned at level 4 would have a greater research collection. So this method has been retested by other researchers, and it has proved useful. But it's important to keep in mind, if you want to do this test, that this is not a client-centered test. It's only a brief measurement of the collection. It doesn't measure the usefulness of the collection, whether or not it's appropriate for your particular interest. And so that might be one way to do it. And generally speaking, in the literature, I said this is a fairly easy way to do it because you're only using 40 titles and looking at the institutional holdings for those titles. You could, of course, look at your ILO patterns and see if there's anything there. But an important thing to keep in mind as you're analyzing your collection is this should not be just a one-time thing. You should analyze your collection periodically to see how it's developing. Some things you could do to fill the gaps that I check when I'm adding things to RCL would be some of the professional tools like the ALA's Roundtable. They have a lot of bibliographies on their websites, everything from books on disabilities to hate crimes, sports, marriage, parenting. There's a whole bunch of topics there that could be really helpful. ALA GLBT RT also maintains 2 book lists. These are not book awards, they're just reading lists. The Over the Rainbow is an adult reading list, and the Rainbow list is for children and YA. You could also look at various awards. Many of you may be familiar with some of these awards, but some of them might be a little new to you. So the Stonewall Book Award from ALA, the Lambda Literary Awards, the Publishing Triangle Awards, the Spectrum Awards, the Bisexual Book Awards, the Alice B. Award, the James Triptey Award, and the Goldies. Some of these are very specific. For example, the Alice B. Award is given annually just to living writers who have published 3 books. So you'd want to really look at what those 3 books are. The James Triptey Award is given annually for science fiction or fantasy that explores our understanding of gender. So there's a lot of variety here that you could use for awards. Some of these are fiction. Some of they would include nonfiction. If you're interested in purchasing any films, Frameline does a really great job of offering some films for purchase. Some of their topics include drag, butch femme, GLBT history, and intersex matters. And of course, you can also find GLBTQ movies within streaming services such as Canopy. Here's a couple places you can check for reviews that I check for reviews. The GLBT Roundtable again. There are many, many journals, some of which are listed here. The American Historical Society has a committee on gay and lesbian history. Their reviews are available online since 2005 for free, so that could be a useful resource for identifying history. I won't go into the details of every one of these journals. Some of them are peer-reviewed. Some of them are not. For example, like the Gay and Lesbian Review, which is not peer-reviewed. It concentrates on the arts and is run by a nonprofit association, so you can subscribe to that for a relatively inexpensive cost. I think it's only like maybe $25 a year maybe for users for individual subscriptions. And a couple other tools you can use are the Journal of Homosexuality, the Journal of Lesbian Studies, the Lambda reviews. I'll point those out because those are actually free. You can just go to their website and see those there. However, they are not peer-reviewed, but the reason they are free is because they are sponsored by a nonprofit organization. There is no print version of the Lambda reviews. And to wrap up, what are some things that you can do to enhance the diversity of your collection? And Anne already mentioned this one. Discard the neutrality myth. The belief that we as selectors are neutral and that we can curate a neutral collection, that's not possible because we all, of course, have our personal biases. I kind of like what librarian Chris Borg wrote. He said, our traditional practices and technologies are not neutral, and without active intervention, we end up with collections that lack diversity, and we end up classifying and arranging our content in ways that further marginalizes works by and about people of color, queer people, indigenous people, and others who don't fit neatly into a classification system that defaults as Western, white, straight, and male. So I thought that was a really prescient quotation that I found very helpful. We also keep in mind that we can influence the reciprocal relationship between publishers because what we purchase, if we only purchase the popular material, we're just going to encourage the publishers to ignore the niche topics within GLBT and also the authors from underrepresented groups. So if we can push back through our purchasing options, that will reinforce to our publishers our commitment to diversity. It also increases the likelihood that diverse voices will get published and have a place in the long-term scholarly record. Use values-based decision-making. Recognize the limitations of data-driven collection development practices such as circulation usage. Keep in mind that demand for library materials may not correspond to a particular portion of the population. It may indicate that you have low demand, but that doesn't mean you have inadequate provision of the materials. Or there may be poor or inappropriate services. Your users may lack expectations or may be unfamiliar with library services. So, for example, if we use circulation statistics, it may lead us to overvalue some items in our collection and undervalue some of our more unique and perhaps lesser used materials. Keep in mind that just make your decisions not just based on data, but also look at the values of inclusivity and diversity. We can improve our cataloging efforts. We could try adding more locally created subject headings. For example, in 2009, the University of Texas created special notes in their 590 field to indicate works associated with the U.S. Latinx GLBTQ community and their collection, and also the Black Queer Studies collection. And Yale began adding a 690 note saying LGBTQ resource since 2007. So these bring together works across disciplines into a virtual collection. And this overrides some of the problems associated with the LCSH. And in the case of UT materials, also enhances the visibility of communities of color. We can also build communication and relationships with our local student and faculty groups. This will help us keep pace with our changing curriculum. We might also want to look to the local community to help identify materials that might be unique or that they might wish to donate to your collections. And of course, work with subject specialists in other areas because this is interdisciplinary in nature. And finally, we need to embrace intentionality. If we're going to have a diverse collection, we have to make concerted efforts, just like that ALA statement said at the beginning, that we need to be deliberate in our efforts to enhance diversity in our collections. So I'm now going to turn it back to Anne.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks for your understanding to our participants who may have been having some issues hearing the sound during Ellen's portion of the presentation. I want to just note that the slides and the archived webinar will be available online in case you need to go back and take a look at things later or in the future. And then also kind of invite you to visit the URL choice360.org/product/RCL to learn more about resources for college libraries and to sign up for a free trial. So those of you who are still with us on the line, I want to invite questions from the audience, comments about what you might be struggling with locally as far as building, creating, evaluating your collections with sensitivity to inclusion, diversity, and equity.
All right, and this is Mark, excuse me, the host here. We do have a few questions in the queue, and as Anne was saying, if you do have questions for either Ellen or Timothy, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A box or into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. One comment that we have, and it's sort of a question from Aruna, is what about geographic diversity? How does that figure into building diverse collections? And I'm not sure exactly who I would toss that one out to, but do any of you have any thoughts on geographic diversity?
I'll make a quick comment. Within the RCL subject heading for the GLBTQ, there is a section on regional studies. It is divided fairly broadly, so just for example, North America, Asia, and Oceania. But there are materials in there, so I do try to find those materials and put them within the existing subject schema.
Okay, great. So we have a question here from Kirsty, and I apologize if I'm butchering your name. And Kirsty asks, any ideas about diversity in the wider collection, for example, ensuring authors of color in the engineering collection and those sorts of things?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Kirsty. I think this is an area where the kinds of collections that we're available to offer are to a certain part restricted by the publications that are available. And so we're part of, I think that's where it goes back to the comment about being part of a larger ecosystem. But I do think that librarians should, when you're at a conference, talk to publishers, talk to vendors, and advocate for them publishing materials that are by a more diverse author pool and that are on a more diverse topic. I think that there is power in there's purchasing power that librarians hold that you can use to advocate for more diverse materials in order to kind of build collections with that in mind.
Excellent, excellent. And we do have a few questions here about recordings. I would just note that, yeah, we did record this webinar and are recording it. And so folks should be able to access the recording sometime tomorrow. So we have, and this is sort of, again, sort of a comment and sort of a question from Gail, who says, nothing was mentioned about the institutional repository. shouldn't the IR be considered part of the library's collection? How, and I wonder how each of you would respond to that. Do you,
Yeah, thanks for your question, Gail. I don't know, I'll ask if Ellen or Tim, either one, have a perspective on the institutional repositories. The focus of resources for college libraries is monographs, so that's why we do include some select web resources, but that's why our conversation today was really centered around monographs. I'll wait a minute, and if either Ellen or Tim have a perspective on institutional repositories as it relates to the broader collection, let them jump in.
Yeah, well, I would second what you said, that that's really not the area that we're focused on. I think it's a legitimate issue, though. And I think most of the people who do selection in African American studies at universities and colleges probably do some faculty liaison, and that certainly they should, if no one else has taken the responsibility, that they should take on the responsibility of getting people at their institutions who may work in that area to contribute to the institutional repository.
I think Anne and Tim make really great points. I have to confess, I did not think about institutional repositories primarily because we don't have one here, which is somewhat sad. But I could see where if you were depositing, for example, dissertations in there, that might be a helpful place to look. For example, if you wanted to see citation analysis of what's being used, that could be really useful. So I think that's a really good point. But again, the RCL is at this point focused on monographs, although I do have some videos in the GLBT collection and also some links to various other materials that are not print.
okay, great. We have a question here from John, who asks, how do you balance building diverse, inclusive collections with only buying the best books available?
Well, I can start. This is Anne. I can start that one, and then again, if Tim and Ellen want to share your thoughts. This is where I really love that phrase, aspirational selection, because I think it gives you the latitude to leave some room in your collection budget for titles that might diversify the collection outside of kind of like your normal purchase practices or your normal approval plan or your PDA. So ways that you can kind of supplement to ensure you're introducing some content into your collection that is going to help balance it. I think that this becomes a challenge when we start relying more and more on possibly vendors to assist in selecting materials or handing, if you're at an institution where faculty are making most of your purchase decisions and requests, I really do think that trying to give some space to building diversity into your collection as you still buy, the best books. Obviously, we're not saying just pick diverse books regardless of their content. Obviously, you're still going to be looking at the quality of the content that's there, but giving yourself a little bit of latitude and dedication to focus on that diversity aspect within your normal collection development policies and practices.
Great. And Ellen or Timothy, do you have anything that you would like to add to that?
Sorry. I don't have anything to add to that at this point. One option might be to kind of like divide up your collection a little bit and maybe say like this year I'm going to concentrate, if you have limited funds, which most of us do, well, this year I'm going to concentrate on buying some lesbian fiction or some gay fiction. And next year I'll try to focus on buying some historical publications. I mean, that might be one way to approach it. It would certainly take a much larger amount of time to try to develop your collection that way, but that's a possibility that you might want to try.
Great. And Timothy, do you have anything to add there?
No, I agree with what
Okay.
you said.
Great. So we have a question here from Richard, and Richard asks, have there been efforts to build diverse collections consortially or collectively across a number of libraries? Do either you, Ellen, or you, Timothy, have any experience working with consortia or groups of libraries to increase the diversity of the shared collection?
No, I don't have any experience with that. Most of the institutions I've worked at were research collections.
Okay.
And so consortial purchasing wasn't a major part of what they did. I think that might have more relevance for small college libraries that have those consortial relationships with similar places.
That makes sense. And Ellen, just sort of curious, do you have any experience working across a consortia?
Let me just say that's a really great idea. I do not have any experience working across a consortia on collection development of GLBT collections. This is primarily because if you're familiar with New Mexico, there's really only this university and the University of New Mexico that are research collections. So it would be a little bit difficult to try to get any kind of diversity when you're only working with two partners.
Yeah, that's
right.
it.
So that would be a challenge for sure here, but I really like the idea. And if there's some way you can figure out how to do it, let us know. That would be very helpful.
Great. So we have a question that came up a little bit earlier from Laurel, who asks, in reviewing book awards, I've noticed more self-published books winning awards. Does RCL include self-published titles?
That's a really good question, Laurel, and I see that Anne has also added it. The question about buying self-published items as a way to add diversity. And that's something actually that the RCL subject editors and I have been discussing recently. So how you balance a kind of the opening of the gate, so to speak, that self-publishing allows, while you still try to maintain kind of a credibility and a quality of content. So to go back to the earlier point that we're not saying that you create diversity by, letting kind of subpar content that you wouldn't normally add to an academic collection in there. We don't have a rule specifically against self-published materials, but there aren't really at this time self-published titles in RCL.
Okay. And we have...
And I just also, while Mark is looking
Yeah,
at
please, go ahead.
I just wanted to correct an earlier, we misspoke. Chris Borg is the library director at MIT and a she. So I just wanted to correct that for the official recorded version.
Sure.
Apologies.
No, it's hard with a Chris.
And sort of on a similar note, folks, there's a few questions in the queue about sharing the recording and that sort of thing, which is totally fine. If you want to share the recording, you should receive that email tomorrow, and please feel free to share it with whomever you would like. So one last sort of comment from Meg, who says, just wanted to say we would welcome the inclusion of fictional titles in resources for college libraries, as Meg's library is attempting to undertake a diversity collection development for their leisure reading collection. So just are there fictional titles in RCL?
Yes, great question. I saw that point, Meg. There are fictional titles. I know that Ellen includes fiction in GLBT studies. There are fictional titles. Of course, we have literature subject areas. Those are primarily aimed at, they're going to be aimed at more of, teaching literature or those primary resources that are most often taught in undergraduate classes, but it also includes things like graphic novels. So I think that that's an important point, though, because I have often wondered about whether we need to kind of create a more leisure reading type fiction collection beyond our literature and the handful of titles that we are selecting from more of an interdisciplinary area studies perspective around fiction. So thank you for that feedback. There is fiction in RCL, but not necessarily what I think we speak about when we're talking about a leisure reading fiction collection.
Oh, great. All right, so we are just about out of time, and before we go, I would like to just remind folks that first off to take a minute and say thank you to Anne and to Timothy and to Ellen for taking time to present today. I think we've gotten some feedback that this is, really, really interesting and a really good presentation. So thank you for your effort. And I would just point out to everyone listening in today that I'm not sure how many times I've said this, but we did record the program, so be on the lookout for that follow-up email. And also, please take a moment to fill out our brief 6-question survey. You should see it in the chat box there. If you could take just a second to fill that out and let us know how we did, we would really appreciate it. We would also like to mention that you should be able to find copies of the slides on the website for the recording, which should be linked to in that follow-up email. All right. Thank you, everyone out there, for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the session, and I hope the rest of your day is great.